Now, for most of you, probably the most common example of iSCSI is going to be a home network whereby you have a Linux box of some variety. I usually have Ubuntu, and you're going to have a Windows client. So we're going to focus on that as our test bed for today. So first of all, we're going to cover installing the iSCSI component, which is going to be our target on our Linux machine. Now, as you can imagine, this means just running the apt install and then the name of the package. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to just do that. Now in this case the package name is relatively straightforward. The package is in fact TGT, and as you can see from the on-screen video, we're pretty much installed already, so this part is as straightforward as it comes really, and there isn't a lot more to be said on it. So after the install finishes, we're going to go ahead and create an iSCSI target. Now I'd like you to keep in mind that there is always more than one way to configure a target, and from this point of view we could go with whole disks, we could go with just partitions. In this case I've chosen to go with images, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder, and I'm going to create a disk image, and I'm going to create it with 20 gig. Now the reason I did this is this way I don't need to mess around with creating partitions or adding additional disks to my VM for the demonstration purposes. However, in your case your mileage may vary, and honestly you may decide, okay, I'm going to partition a disk and present that instead. So next I'm going to go ahead and create the target. Now with the target, one of the things that you're going to see that's different each time is the target ID. So that's the TID, which you can see in this command line. So this is going with TID1, which I've already done earlier, just to check that everything was working beforehand. So I could go with TID2 or others, but this will work for now. That creates my ID, and just as we've had with Windows and other environments, I now need to assign a disk to it. So I go ahead and I give my image as my input, and now I'm going to assign the initiator. So this is the last part of the configuration where we go through and just apply the ID. Now again, there's a couple of different switches that can be used. We could use, as an example, the IP address. We can also use the IQN number, which, if you know the client IQN. Also, if you want to add additional IPs, you can do either the whole range by just putting the 0/subnet, or alternatively entering each IP individually. Now we've also just checked that the configuration is correct, so we just have the output on screen that we can check block sizes, disk, and all the variables are as we expect. So from this point of view we have confirmation that the config is set as we wanted it to be. Now if you are having difficulty keeping up at this point, don't worry, the commands are going to be in the comments, so don't worry. Moving swiftly on, we're now going to save the configuration, because despite everything it actually hasn't been saved to anything other than working memory. So whilst it's running from the point of view that I can go and connect to my Windows client now if I really wanted to, one reboot and I've lost it. So I'm just going to ask or check the directory first of all to show you the config file. So this is the targets.conf. And if we look into it, we'll see that the target.conf file doesn't actually contain any information at this point. So just as an example, we get target, and we'll go and look at the file. So the contents of the file, just to see what is in there. Then you see we have an include value, and that's it. Right? Looks pretty empty. So what we're going to do is run quickly the admin command to dump the configuration to file. This will allow us both to save it and then have it available next time we reboot the machine, which, okay, in Linux world you don't reboot that often, but it does happen, and you don't want to suddenly find out that you've forgotten where your configuration files are, and or lost the drive because you just didn't know what the config was originally, etc, etc. So we're just going to do the TIG dump command and then dump it out to the config file, and then we're going to look at it again to see if the config is as we expect it to be. So now we've got the file open, you can see the configuration and you can see the line items. Now realistically we could edit it here and just do a restart of the service, and that way we could avoid a lot of the command lines, but this is perfectly good for now. So now we're going to move on to doing the Windows guest. So our Windows machine in this case happens to be a Windows 2016, but exactly the same principle applies if it's a Windows 10. So we've got just a couple of commands to run through to add the disk. The first one that's kind of off the bat is we're going to configure the firewall. Again, this is straightforward enough, but we've got to let the ports through, otherwise we're not going to get very far. Next up, we're going to tell it where to find our iSCSI host, which is the next part of the configuration. And once that's done, we'll be able to connect the drives quite easily. So we're just going to go ahead and then add the drives as needed. So we're going to start the service first of all, and then once the service is started and set to automatic, we're just going to go ahead and connect. Now you might note that I'm using IP addresses in most of this video. This is because my two VMs don't have any DNS resolution and I haven't set up the host names to be able to see one another. I'm just simply using the IP addresses. This obviously can vary for you. You might decide to use host names instead. Feel free. If you can see one another and resolve the host names, all fine. So here we are now with the disk effectively added. Now we just got to go into our Windows machine and quickly switch the disk on. So just like if you had plugged in a blank hard disk, you need to basically tell Windows what drive letter it's going to get and format it, etc. So we're just going to run through those steps to quickly prove that A, it was successful, and B, prove that we can actually access and use the drive. So I'm just going to go ahead and format it very quickly, and then I'm going to create a new folder on that disk just to prove that all works as expected. And as we can see, the folder is basically just a test one, so no spectacular naming there, but it was able to create it, proving that we have read-write access. And that wraps it up for this video. So if you like it, give it a like. If you don't, give it a thumbs down and subscribe for more content.